Alright, so I played a game recently called Reckoning of New York, and that brought me to make some thoughts about free games as a whole. There are three of them now, and I've played 1 and 2 of something of an autopilot, for most part. There were secondary playthroughs, resulting in almost the same results. However, somehow apparently I've missed an extremely important part of 2. In any case, I do believe there's something fascinating about these games. I definitely wouldn't recommend buying them unless you are already into the world of darkness. Significantly so. And even if you are, then Shadows alone, or better yet Parliament of Knives, are just a better choice. Vampire Regent is a pretty cool story too, although not World of Darkness. But all three are just a bit too much to buy, I'd say. Whatever the case may be, I did think about this story arc as a whole. Whatever it might bring in the future, where it is now, and wherever it started. So, Coteries. The first game is a mess, plain and simple. I believe there is a saying about first pancake always being a mess, and that's applied to many other things. And it definitely applies here. While I adore the art, atmosphere, and enjoy the light background music, the actual game itself offers very little. Short and seemingly different choices, yet not really allowing any degree of roleplay. The illusion of choice. At best blocking out some companion choices, at worst railroading into disappointing twist. Coteries is a setup for the rest, and it works as that, however, doing very little aside from this. Shadows of New York doesn't have a flexible protagonist, unlike Coteries. It focuses on Julie and her alone, and she is a treat. By which I mean she's a frigid bitch who must be a nightmare to interact with. However, I rarely feel like I relate to a protagonist as much as I did here. The world doesn't throw her bone, instead it does anything but. The art, the atmosphere, the music were again on the level of Coteries. However, this time this story had a better structure, a better twist, and a more enjoyable couple of scenes. In addition, the setup of Coteries led into the development, with most notable one being Hope, turning from a shut-in with schizophrenia into a tech guru. Others do have their moments too, but it's all mainly set dressing for Julie and the farce she has to deal with. I think it's clear which is my favorite here, even if, as it turns out, I somehow got a bad ending and managed to screw up much more interesting, although dark ending, whatever. Perhaps I am just a lowly pushover which somehow fall into the good guy routine. Whatever the case may be, I am playing through that again soon. So, this brings me to Reckoning of New York. And this is the most controversial one. So personal gripes first, the art is different. While the backgrounds are as good as ever, the characters are no longer this blurry, sketchy style, instead looking AI generated, smooth, clean and soulless. In fact, I've only enjoyed the look of 2 characters. Again, Julia, who looks marvelous, and Paddy, who seems exactly how I imagine a member of that clan to be, instead of a cartoony joke Bloodlines or other media does. Madness is a multifaceted thing, represented through many, and I do mean many, faces. One of which is a dark, tormented visage, driven through the brink of desperation and able to control themselves and forced to act the part of the weak. Right, so the music is okay, and the atmosphere is still very much on point, although a lot more lighthearted, or just at least a little more lighthearted, which is down to the new protagonist, who is an amusing sort of being. Monologuing and dialoguing, if that's the word, so much that even she herself is tired of hearing herself talk, yet somehow being a delight at times, a riot at others and a tragic heroine at the rest of the time. Kali is definitely a step away from Julia, even if her writing does seem to mirror them at times. I found her an interesting departure, especially in the last few chapters. The relationship with her sire is a horror which I imagine is all too familiar for so many people out there. Especially women. A charming, powerful man whisking you away into another caper, somehow irritating you to no end, yet being impossible to resist. Some part of me wishes I could do that. Thankfully that's not the dominant part of me. You might be asking yourself, what is the problem then, as everything seems to work fairly well, or well enough? Well, the problem lies in the actual story. The events, the way there, the resolution and the end in itself. Which is a gigantic pill to swallow, so big one would find it impossible not to choke. Also, I did notice that I turn a lot more verbose whenever I play visual novels. I suppose whenever I'm exposed to a better vocabulary than an average Reddit poster, I tend to display a modicum of intelligence so unfamiliar to me otherwise. And yet this game proves itself to be a disappointing entry, because I've had few expectations going into it, yet it seemed to be doing so much better than the other two, on the surface. Coteries was a failure, an acceptable one for a first try. It was serviceable, and the ending twist was a mistake, because it leaves out the most interesting character in the ground, setting up an irrelevant pansy as some sort of mastermind. Which never paid off, by the way, despite being a face which keeps appearing in each of his games. Some might bring up the metaphors about how politics of one life are always bringing about bleak realities, but this is not an enjoyable story, not very interesting, plain and simple. Shadows succeeds in telling a much smaller story, with a twist being abject failure being a given, yet somehow turning it all on its head. Or, in simple words, the writer downscaled the scope, used what was already there, and after shuffling it all around with a new character, made something interesting. Kinda like the DLCs in Dishonored. Reckoning, meanwhile, seems to try increasing the scope again, introducing a whole plethora of new plot points, characters and locations, and then somehow attempting the exact same story as Shadows. A fruitless search for a party which simply can't be found. Rehashing the same plots, told the same through slightly different lens, but this time also adding a gigantic earth-shattering plot point, which doesn't go anywhere. Which is my main problem. But there is also a smaller problem. A teensy bugbear poking his ugly head out, which is the writing. What the writer here did is become Kali, cracking jokes, making fun of people, and whenever anything turned serious they would avoid the dive going too deeply. Which means that whenever they tried to write other characters they all felt very one-note, caricatures, with the two worst offenders being Hope and Julia. While Kadir changed too significantly, it was explained by his position. Hope meanwhile doesn't act like Hope, instead being something of a soulless entity which pops up for a bit and vanishes right away. Julia, however, being my favorite before, she felt like essentially the same person as Kali, although in a different position. She does the same things, says the same things, and ends up helping her because they are the same. Lazy writing. I know it took me a while to get here, but this is the other problem. It's just lazy writing. Characters don't have enough characters to them. But it doesn't stop there. Again, like I said, the Shadows story being rehashed, this whole story feels like a repeat. Oh look, another clue doesn't go anywhere. Oh look, we connected this character to a shitstorm, doesn't go anywhere. Look, more mysteries and cool characters unearthed, which doesn't go anywhere. And Paddy, being the playable protagonist unlocked after the first run, is essentially a non-option. What is here is actually a new perspective on the exact same events, yet it's not even much of that. And at times there are typos and phrases clearly written from Kali's perspective, without any changes to account for Paddy being the protagonist this time. Meanwhile, the few moments where the protagonists were away last a very short time. Even something as amusing as a little heist with Hope is a few paragraphs at most. Could have been an amusing study of what Paddy is, or a little opportunity to give more background to him. Yet instead it's a blur, he just spaces out. And the rest is the same. Paddy doesn't the protagonist make. Nor do the choices matter. I'm unsure whenever they are predetermined or a rehash of what I've picked in the previous playthrough with Kali, but the important bit here is what I don't like, what there was a lick of difference. Whenever I was Kali or Paddy, it was the same thing. The only real difference and a point to praise is the meanwhile segments at the end of every chapter. For Kali it's a confusing something. For Paddy it's tying up loose ends, and they are very major ends. Anarchs, Kadir, Pain Servant, all of those get explained, and I have to make this clear, the story in the background is exciting, which is what upsets me. This is yet again a rehash and a setup for more. And what is given to a player, what is presented in the foreground, is severely lacking. Depressing. It's making me sad is what it does. It's not awful. I've seen much worse, even recently, but I'll talk about it some other time. Instead, I feel so negative about Reckoning because I see myself in it. Although it's really all three games. I want to write, and the problems I see in this game are the exact problems I face whenever I attempt to write. Every character might start distinct, but I soon drift back into what I find comforting and easy to copy. Myself. Then the actual story, I have these ideas, this Machiavellian plot, unraveling itself in my head, yet it's only the background. While it's a mirror staring back at me in the story proper, in the foreground. The hints of brilliance pierced in the overwhelming mediocrity, but I persevere, and soon enough the story turns into a predictable slop which bores me to both read and write. But I push it for the sake of completion, to say I did it, only to leave it as a draft I've done years ago, forever unpolished. Hundreds of thousands of words now. 3 entirely separate stories, 2 of which are finished and the third one is about 80% done. And when reckoning comes along, as it hits me, it's like a sack of bricks with the same issues I see in my own writing. A depressing story without an actual end, abrupt and empty. Just like me. But trilogy is definitely not a recommendation.